All right, so you might be wondering, well, why are we passing in an anonymous function here instead of a named function? We certainly could reference a function like we did in the previous example in the last lesson where we had a run the example function. However, usually this code is only run at one time during sort of the initialization step of the web page, and so you don't need to give it a name because you only expect it to be called one time. All right. So you might wonder, why do we need the ready method at all in this line of code? All right, so hopefully you're paying attention to the previous lesson. That's exactly why we need the ready method. If you recall, I pointed out that there was a potential gap in time between the moment when the DOM is fully created and ready for use and the moment when your web page has completely finished downloading all of the images and other external resources, at which point the window.onload event fires, and was really the first opportunity for us to write code to work with the DOM. But that gap is dangerous because users can potentially be working with the page as it's rendering, but before we're able to add or attach our JavaScript code. So jQuery solves this dilemma by testing the DOM to see if it's ready and uses several different techniques to determine if the DOM is ready. In some cases, in the newer browsers, they'll raise an event to distinguish between the DOM ready and the window.onload. So jQuery will use that. In older browsers, there are some well-established tricks and hacks that have been uncovered to accomplish this. And so it'll use those. It'll degrade to those if the newer methods are not available. And then finally, as a last resort, jQuery will degrade gracefully and fall back to window.onload if all else fails. Okay, so this is what the ready method does. It allows you to define an anonymous function or name function where you can write code that accesses the DOM safely. So most developers use this as the place where they define their event handlers, wiring them up like we did in the previous lesson, and perform other initialization tasks for the web page. So again, we'll talk about event handlers and wiring those up soon. Now, here's another little shortcut. Instead of this full syntax of $, passing in the document, calling the ready method, we can simply use this shortcut and just delete all of this stuff right there. And so you can see jQuery already has a bunch of shortcuts for us, so we don't have to type unnecessarily. I'm just going to refresh the web page and it still works. All right. And for more information about all of these sorts of things, you really need to spend some time in the API reference. So I usually start with the jQuery core and start working my way from there down. Or I can do a quick search for, like, for example, ready. And I search for that and I can find the ready method. All right. And I can read about it and how it works and so on. All right. Now, one other curious thing about jQuery is that we've already talked about it. Here, let's go to the core section. So just click core in the browse the jQuery API and then click on jQuery. And you'll note that there are several different ways to call jQuery. I want to talk about the syntax used to invoke jQuery because this often trips up developers who are new to jQuery, just like it would be not so obvious to go from jQuery passing in a document.ready all the way down to just this single $, and then an opening and closing parenthesis, right? So this often trips people up, and I just want to talk about the different ways in which the jQuery function can be invoked and what that means. Whenever we pass in, like for example, a CSS selector expression like this, so you might see this. All right, or something like this. Or something like this. Okay? So these are different ways, different CSS selectors that we're passing in, and whenever we do that, what's returned is an object of type jQuery. Or what most people refer to as a jQuery object. And if you take a look at the documentation here, you can see that in this case, whenever we pass in a selector to jQuery, it'll return an object of type jQuery. And so you can see that this refers us to the slash types slash pound jQuery to push us down on this, the different types that are available inside of jQuery, right? And so what exactly is a jQuery object and how does it differ from the jQuery function? Well, the jQuery object is an array-like structure, or rather it's a collection of document object model elements comprised of elements from the document that match the selector as defined in the input parameter to the jQuery function. So in this case, we're saying find all paragraph tags. In this case, we're saying use this CSS selector to find all, so a collection of DOM elements that have an ID of my first paragraph. There should only be one, right? Or find all elements in the document and return them as a collection where their class is important text. All right, so what this returns is a collection of objects represented in the document object model. This jQuery object that's returned also provides full access to the breadth of jQuery attributes and methods that you can perform on that collection of DOM elements. So in the case that we had before, where we were working with document, at this point, we're working with the entire DOM element, and that's why we call the .ready. We're working with the full collection of the document object model, all right, and then calling the ready method, saying, tell me when all the elements inside of the document are ready and have been instantiated, all right? And so if we were to call another example, like for example, fade out. So now we're saying, whenever you encounter this line of code, bring me back a collection of paragraph objects from the document object model, and now on all of those, that entire collection, call the fade out property, which will, or method rather, which will make all of the paragraphs slowly fade out and no longer visible on the web page. Okay, so some people talk about the jQuery object. You'll have to determine by context whether they're talking about this or the entire thing. Are they talking about the function that you normally would call using the word jQuery, or are they talking about everything that jQuery returns, the entire collection that's returned? Okay, and sometimes you're just going to have to figure that out by the context of whatever they're discussing at that given point in time. At least that's what I found. But you know, we've looked at one use of the jQuery function by passing in selectors, but there's other things that we can do with the jQuery function. For example, you can create HTML on the fly and then attach the HTML to the document object model kind of dynamically. So let's take a look at an example of that. I'll go ahead and use the full jQuery word, knowing that I could just use the alias instead. But let's just do this to make it obvious. And if I pass in a bunch of HTML, so for example, here we go, div ID equals badge, and then we'll close the div out. And notice I'm doing this inside of a single set of quotation marks. So we'll put in an image with a source equals badge.gif, and then alt equals badge earned for achievement, all right, or something along those lines. All right, so this is a pretty long line of code, but ultimately we're just passing in a string that we hope to be created into a series of DOM elements that we can then attach to our existing DOM on our web page. So we can dynamically add new HTML to our web page using this syntax. All right, so then another way that you can see jQuery used is to attach new functions or objects to the jQuery object. So in this case, we can do jQuery dot, or, you know, hey, let's just have fun here and use the alias this time. We want to create with my custom method equals function alert hi. And then we can also create other objects inside of the namespace. Like, for example, if I wanted to create a list box, I can do something like this and do a show. So I would create a function here that would, you know, include the code to show my lightbox. and then hide my lightbox. And I'd write some code in there to hide it, and then I would do a position, so function, and then initiate. And just to be clear, the benefit of this approach is that we've removed both our function declaration and our object declaration from the global namespace and nestled it safely inside of the jQuery namespace. This isn't necessary. You could simply create your own namespace for these sorts of things like we've seen in a previous lesson. However, you will see people writing code like this out there, and they're probably using jQuery's namespace so that they don't pollute the global namespace. So the moral of the story is twofold. First of all, the jQuery function is very powerful. If there's a set of parentheses after the word jQuery or its alias, the $sign, then you probably are looking at one of the overloaded versions of the jQuery function, as we looked at on this page right here. And so I would just encourage you to review and see, is it a selector that's being passed in? Is it just literal HTML being passed in? Is it a function being passed in? And then based on that, jump down and learn more about its usage from jQuery support files, right? And so remember that in most cases, the jQuery function returns a jQuery object, which is usually a collection of DOM elements that match the selector that you pass in the input parameter of the jQuery function. In some cases, it can represent a brand new set of DOM elements that are being inserted into the DOM, as is the case here. All right. The other moral to the story is that you're dealing with the jQuery object directly. If you see a period after the word jQuery, like we do here, or a period after its alias, then the code is attempting to attach itself to jQuery's namespace to avoid being part of the global namespace, which we said was a bad thing. And then there's one more thing that you'll see a jQuery function do. You might see an anonymous function that's passed in like so, like right here, how we used it in this particular case. And jQuery is smart enough to know the type of argument that you passed it, and since you passed it a function in this case, you therefore intend it to be used as a shortcut to the ready method. Otherwise, it would default to its normal usage like we've seen already. So also I think that it's important for you to realize that the call to the ready method can be used as many times as you need for it to be used. So I'm going to go ahead and delete all of this code right here. And I could even put these in separate files, but I'm just going to do this really quick. And I'm just going to add this works 1, this works 2, this works 3. All right. So now I have 4 versions of our ready method here, all defined in kind of their own chunk of code. So now let's see what happens whenever we reload our web page. We got 4 alert boxes to pop up. All right, so just keep that in mind that you can, in several different code files, if you need to attach new event handlers or whatever the case might be, you can continue using the ready method, and it'll just keep attaching things to kind of a queuing process, and then once the ready method is ready to fire off, it'll start executing all those things that we've been attaching to it over time. Pretty cool, right? Now, a lot of these are just kind of exceptions to the rule, and I'm going to delete all of that. In most cases, whenever you pass an argument into the jQuery function, you're passing in a selector that represents the elements of the DOM that you want to work with. Again, let me just give you an example of this. In this case, we want to work with all the paragraph elements in the DOM. So to choose those elements in the DOM, you use a CSS syntax. So any elements like we have here, any classes like I used before, important text, or any specific IDs like my first paragraph. These are all in play, and this is the normal usage, or the usage you see most often within jQuery code. And you can also use CSS3 specific selectors. The newest version of CSS3 has some really wild selectors that are available, and so you can get very creative and very specific and target those elements in the DOM that you want to work with. But once you have defined this, you're working now with what? The jQuery object, right? And you can call any of jQuery's methods at that point, and the methods themselves will all return a jQuery object as well. So fade out, for example, and we can also like say give it how many milliseconds we want it to fade out, and then call it one more time fade in, and say fade back in, so we can make it kind of glow for, or just blink briefly, right? So this returns a jQuery object on which we call the fade out method, which calls a jQuery object, which then calls the fade in, which returns a jQuery object, and we can keep chaining these together, all right? Okay, so we've had a lot of fun here. Let's go ahead and start really looking at how this is used in other simple scenarios. So I'm just going to go ahead and comment this out. This page, you can see that we have a paragraph with an ID of first, a paragraph with an ID of second, and a paragraph with an ID of third. We have a header with an ID of title. We have an anchor with an ID of my anchor. All right, so this should be enough to have some fun with, right? So let's work with the title, the H1 with an ID of title. So to get to it, what are we going to do? Can you think about what this will look like? All right, I'm going to use the pound symbol, which says we're talking about an ID for a given element, and the pound symbol representing the ID, dot text, and I'm going to just say yay, I can now get at the H1 immediately. All right, so let's go ahead and save this, and then let's refresh our page here. You can see that at the very outset I can modify the H1 text without using inner HTML, which we talked about was a bad idea in the previous lesson. Very easy to do. So that's working with the text inside of it. Now let's work with, let's go with the ID first, which will return the single paragraph with an ID of first, and then we're going to change the HTML and say, just add an H2 there. And I'm going to say great quotes. Go ahead and save this, and then let's look at the after. There we go. So it changed the text to the words great quote, and it wrapped an H2 around it. So here we're modifying just the text. Here we're adding HTML as well. Cool. All right, so let's go work with the first element again. And now we're going to use prepend, and so we don't want to blow away that line in HTML in this one here. This is where we're replacing it. Here we just want to add something right before our first paragraph. So here we're going to type in great quotes. Prepend, spell it correctly here, and now let's go and refresh it. Okay, so now we were able to prepend our H2 great quotes above the paragraph itself. Awesome. Let's keep working with this. In fact, I'm just going to go ahead and leave that there, and I'm going to show how to add stuff after. So here again, we're going to work with first, and then we're going to append an H3 for you to ponder. Let's save that. And so you can see now here is our first paragraph. We were appending, and now we are, or prepending, and now we are appending, which puts it after our selector. Great. And so I think it's important to note here that, and I'll just type this out, append and prepend work inside the given selection. There are some others that we can look at, like before, after, insert before, insert after, that work outside the given selection. All right. So I would just encourage you to take some time and to learn about all the different ways to manipulate a given selection by looking at the manipulation. And you can see that we can add classes to selections. Here we've already looked at or talked about the after. Here's the append, changing attributes, the before. We can change the CSS of a given selection, and just literally dozens of these, and we can't go through them all in a video, but they work exactly the same way as what we've demonstrated up to this point. All right, let's look at just a couple more and then we're going to wrap this up. So we had, if you recall, an anchor called my anchor, and I'm going to change the attribute. Which attribute? The href, and I'm going to change it from let's see, from learnvisualstudio.net, my website. So let's take a look at this. So currently the href attribute is pointing to learnvisualstudio.net. However, I can change the attribute, the href attribute, to channel9.msdn.com. So let's go ahead and save that. And let's refresh. Whoops. All right, and now you can see programmatically I'm able to change it on the fly to go to channel 9. Awesome. And then finally, you'll notice that in our HTML here, I reference a style sheet called style14.css. If we take a look at that file, it merely creates a large red font. All right, and what I want to do is apply that dynamically to the title. So here we go. We're going to reference the title, and then we're going to call add class. So we're going to add a CSS class called standout. And if this is all wired up correctly, the next time we look at our web page, we get not only it have created a large font, but I think we also, I skipped over it, but we aligned it to the right hand side as well. Whoops. There we go. Yeah, text align right, which I forgot to point out. And so it has these results just to make sure that it draws our attention. Okay, so this was a very high level, very quick overview of making selections and then calling attributes and methods on the return jQuery object. And up to this point, for the most part, we've been working with just IDs for individual items. But what I want to do in the next video is talk more about CSS selectors and show the other things that you can do to get at individual elements within the DOM. So I'll see you in the next lesson. Thank you. Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with LearnVisualStudio.net. In this lesson, we'll talk about jQuery selectors. A jQuery selector allows you to grab one or more DOM elements using a cascading style sheet syntax. Remember from a couple of videos ago, we are defining the context by passing CSS selectors into the jQuery function so that we can then work with the collection of elements that we've selected, all right? But as you'll see, jQuery goes beyond what you might typically see in CSS, giving you the power to get creative with how you select and navigate through the DOM. Now, as with most topics related to jQuery and JavaScript, there's so much material that it would be impossible to cover it all and fit it into a single video. So I'm merely going to show you about a dozen examples, and then I'm going to point you to jQuery's own comprehensive list on their own API documentation website so you can experiment from there. All right, so let's go ahead and set up this example. Make sure that you have the code that I have included with this video. You should be able to download it from wherever you downloaded this video or wherever you're currently streaming it. But I'm looking at a file called c9js_15.html. It is a simple HTML file. Let's just walk through some of its features. First of all, a couple of scripts. The first external script refers to the Microsoft CDN version of the jQuery library file. And then the second script file refers to the script15.js. Currently it is empty, but we'll start adding things to it in just a moment. And then finally we have a link to an external style sheet, style15.css. If we open that up, you can see that I've merely defined a style for a class named highlight. And so we're going to apply this highlight class to the different selections that we make, so it stands out and we can see which selections were made based on the selectors we passed into the jQuery function. All right. So if we take a look at the body of the document itself, we have an H1, a header with the word JavaScript example, a couple of paragraphs, each with different IDs, first, second, third. I added a name attribute to the second paragraph just so we can look at how we can select DOM elements using attributes. In this case, we'll just use the name attribute. And then I add an unordered list with a simple set of 6 list items. A couple of those list items will have a class that I've applied called chosen. In fact, you can see this chosen class appears throughout the document a couple of times. And then at the very end, I've added this empty paragraph, and I'll show you how we'll use that using some special selectors that have been added to jQuery. All right. So let's go ahead and just minimize that for the moment and open up our script file. Our first order of business is to make sure that we've got our script file wired up correctly, and so I'm merely going to create a little alert just to let me know that everybody that my HTML file can see my script file. So when I open this up, I immediately get our hi alert box, so we're in good shape there. I'm going to delete this out now that I know that everything's wired up correctly. And so let's go ahead and start selecting like we did in the previous video where we started selecting by ID. So here, just to get warmed up and remind you, we're just going to select the DOM element that has the ID of first. We're going to add a class to it, and we'll add that class that we created in our CSS file, highlight. So let's save that and now open this up. And you can see that we've applied that highlight class, which merely adds a background color of yellow to this DOM element. Awesome. And then let's go ahead and select by element. And so here we're going to do just all paragraphs. And we'll comment this one out. So now we're going to select all paragraphs in the document and highlight them. All right, and that seems to work. Great. And then the last easy one we'll do is we'll choose by class. And so we have that chosen class that I've applied to several different list items and a paragraph, or a span, forget which. We'll find out here in a second. Okay, there we go. All right, so now let's take a look at some slightly more advanced cases. For example, this is just CSS, so we should be able to use anything we can use in CSS, right? So let's go the first paragraph and combine it with chosen. Using a comma operator. And so you can see we have the first paragraph in our selection, and then also any elements that have the chosen class. All right. So we can create, I guess you call them combinations. All right, so let's go ahead now and move on to some other cases.